Bagay. Ba ntse ba dutse. Good afternoon. Welcome back, delegates. I'm sure you are more energized now. We will now give an opportunity to SAFTU to come and do presentation.
I don't know if I've switched the correct button, but I guess I did. Thank you very much, Program Director. My name is Martin. Musia is my surname. I represent SAFTU. And Program Director, let me start by saying all protocol observed. And of particular importance, let me, from this platform, thank COSATU, province, in particular Ntate Mahlatsi, for making sure that SAFTU is part of this process. And having said that, let me indicate that we all know that SAFTU just emerged from its National Congress, whereupon we successfully elected leadership and also have had time to discuss different policies and resolution in that Congress. The one that we're going to submit to this provincial legislature, its demands contained in the socio-economic section. So this is our demand. In this section, this is a section 77(1) in bracket B, notice directed to the South African government as a whole, to its components, parts named in the pages below, to organized business in general, and to the specific businesses named below. All of these parties have caused grievances to South African Federation of Trade Unions, SAFTU, members, and we therefore are calling on the government and business to heed our demands, also outlined in these pages below. SAFTU is of the view that Section 77 notice required the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC, to fairly assess the socio-economic grievances expressed by SAFTU and seek a remedy through negotiations. The pages that follow represent the grievances and demands that SAFTU members are putting on record for government and business to address. South Africa finds itself at a precipice. The economic malaise currently being experienced places the nation at a point of no return. The levels of poverty, unemployment, in particular amongst our youth and women, inequalities, corruption, crime, and etc., has reached such proportions that the country can be plunged into another civil war. and strive if nothing is done. Our schools, hospitals, public transport, in particular rail, justice system, correctional services center have become dysfunctional. And members of CASATU have raised this issue before us today. So it's not, we did not steal it, leadership, we had it before you presented it. As if this is not enough, our country is being battered by a wave of ecological crisis that creates absolute havoc through heavy storms that have left the poor more vulnerable in greater parts of the country, engulfed in long spells of drought that further threaten livelihood. We all remember currently what is happening in KZN. People are just perishing as if they are flies. Food security and sovereignty, we risk losing another generation of youth to drugs and vicious cycle of crime. And comrades from SATU, the teachers, are raising this point sharply in their presentation. Women, including the aged, lived in fear in their homes and streets. Government is collapsing, overrun by chronism, corruption, and neglect. This point of neglect has been sharply raised by Treasury in their input, in that, among others, which we find very much scandalous, that one company had to close down because the route infrastructure is just, I don't know what is the correct word. Amongst every state-owned enterprise is facing a death spiral of financial collapse. Eskom, South African Airways, Auto Parks, PRASA are all in their knees with more workers, jobs, and services to the poor on the line. So this is a threat of many workers being laid off, retrenched, and dismissed. There is a strong intention by key officials to sell the family jewels to their friends at the expense of poor, for whom these state assets are vital. This has to do with what is happening with PPEs, projects that are mushrooming all over the country. In particular, the solar issue that is cropping up in the Northern Cape. Every day passes, this crisis gets worse, and suffering of our people intensifies. It is as if government officials live in wonderland. It's like they are not from here. All these things happens as if they don't know what is happening. One particular, point of reference is the issue that is raised by Honorable from the Department of Treasury regarding the situation in Botshabelo and Kwakwa. We surprised that issue, Kwakwa and Botshabelo is raised as an issue of a hub that does not exist. For instance, it's a ghost town. I don't know when last have the department visited Kwakwa. It's terrible there. There is no one single company that is operating there. It's ghost. I don't know. I really don't know what are they raising there. Probably they're not from here. They do not see the immense suffering of our people caused by economic hardship. How many more mothers must come home to find their daughters brutally raped and murdered? How many more thanks very much for that assistance. How many more children must be left to drown in pit latrines, these pit toilets. How many Michael Komapis must there be? No sociology degree is needed to know that the terrible nightmare of women abuse, gender-based violence, and the war on women's bodies is rooted in mass unemployment and its disruption of traditional forms of masculinity. Power ya bontate. While not everything occurs because of the country's economic collapse is making everything worse. Enough is enough. SAFTU is submitting this Section 77 notice following a process of intense discussion with other working class formation to start a new revolution. Ndate Mahlatsi, you've been raising this point that it's about time that we join forces. That will put an end to this downward spiral. We will no longer allow tinkering on the margins of the problem. Now, Section 1 of our demands is worker rights and crisis of representation. We are living in a society where there is a crisis of representation. What we mean is that increasingly large numbers of our people are feeling that their interests are not being adequately represented. Politicians at almost all levels remain distant and unreachable. You only see them at the time of elections when they persuade you to come and vote for them. But over and above that, you don't see them. They are nowhere to be found. Hence, we appreciate this platform, Madam Speaker, once in a lifetime, an opportunity to come here and speak to you directly as workers and representing workers. We appreciate that. Decision-making takes place behind closed doors and without inputs from local people and their organization. Civil society groupings are viewed with suspicion when they raise the need for openness and transparency. We are embedded in a culture where announcements take place, but no engagement or active involvement. Ward committees barely function. Involvement in politics is diminishing, and this serves to undermine democracy. Because if you exclude us, that is not democracy. Allow us platforms such as this, and then so that we see democracy prevailing. The danger is that effectively self-selecting elites of one description or another makes decisions for millions of people but are not held accountable. Sadly, this exclusiveness is not reserved solely for government and business, but has its reflection in the labor movement and in the practices of sections of labor who want to maintain their control and influence over institutions and structures where they are located. This is particularly true of NETLEC and of bargaining councils. SAFTU is effectively excluded from NETLEC despite the fact that it is the second largest federation in the country. Why are you excluding us? We want, through you, Madam Speaker, this matter be raised so that this thing is dealt with of excluding SAFTU in NETLEC. And its affiliates are excluded from particular bargaining council on the grounds that they do not meet the joining membership criteria, which are manipulated and changed precisely for that purpose. SAFTU therefore demands the following. 1, on the National Economic Development and Labor Council, we say that it must be democratized. We insist on the right of SAFTU and working class formation to be represented at NETLEC, currently the only site of negotiations on national scale socio-economic policies. Selective rules were implemented just prior to SAFTU's launch that only apply to parties outside NETLEC and which have obstructed entry. Despite the fact that NETLEC was established an act of parliament to provide a voice for all labor. As a result of this restrictive barrier to entry, SAFTU, together with hundreds of working class formations, united in the Working Class Summit and in the COVID-19 People's Coalition, continue to be excluded from deliberations that will impact on all of us directly. That is why we say nothing about us without us. SAFTU demands that NETLEC must remove the barriers that exclude legitimate participation of workers and working class organizations to enable it to become truly representative. 2, bargaining council must be democratized. Thousands of workers continue to be excluded from collective bargaining arrangements in the country. The bargaining council, in particular in the public sector, which includes state-owned enterprise, are allowed by government to consistently increase the threshold of membership for those seeking membership and representation. This measure is to deliberately exclude unions within the sector. While this is happening, the bargaining council imposed levies on non-membership of those workers kept outside, even though in some cases there are other levies of bargaining council for the purpose of collective bargaining. While we subscribe to the principle of majoritarian, the manner in which this is applied results in the deliberation exclusion of thousands of workers. What must be noted is that the exclusion may well concentrate power and influence in the hands of particular unions, but overall it weakens power of a united working class. SAFTU demands that doors of the bargaining council be opened so that they become more representative and less exclusive. It's a priority when workers are being put under pressure by a crisis we are in, and when workers' unity is desperately required. 3, bargaining council agreement must be honored and implemented. The crisis in the public sector bargaining council, where government is prepared to use a range of measures to avoid implementing an agreement that was struck with unions in the PSBC and has caused outrage amongst workers. The very basis for our industrial relations system is being undermined by government, which is supposed to be based on free collective bargaining and, crucially, respect for agreements that are made. SAFTU demands that the agreement between government and public sector agreement be honored by government. SAFTU rejects with contempt the imposition of wage freeze. COSATU is raising this matter earlier before us, and we concur with them. We did not steal it. Once again, comrades, it's already prepared. SAFTU condemns the cut of 161 billion from the wage bill of the government employees and demands its restoration. I guess unions that spoke earlier have spoken to this issue, strategically raising it that fill in the posts that are existing in different departments. So we have a lot in common, Dr. Mahlatsi. SAFTU demands that all vacancies in the public service be filled without any further delays. DINOSA is raising this sharply on their presentation. We concur as SAFTU. 4, worker rights are human rights. The Labor Relations Act amendments, SAFTU's view on the 2018 LRA amendments are well known. It warned that amendments are unworkable and are effectively designed to undermine workers and trade union power and influence. The key problem are the amendments concerning balloting and picketing, as well as the Code of Conduct on Collective Bargaining, which includes new rules about strike notices. As SAFTU predicted, since the proclamation, these amendments have had a chilling effect upon the rights to strike. They must be repealed, and a dispensation which is fair and does not favor the ruling class must be introduced. On the strike ballot, although in principle employers are unable to interdict a strike because of a union's failure to comply with its constitution requiring it to ballot its members, Section 67 of the Labor Relations, we have noticed a number of alarming developments. The Register of Labor Relations has taken upon himself to enforce balloting by calling upon unions to produce ballot paper and other documentary or electronic records of the ballot. His requirement that this is done is usually when the strike begins. If the documents are not provided within his stipulated time period, or the documents do not, in his opinion, comply with the strike ballot guidelines, he threatens the registration of the union. In one case, Dimausa, one union, was deregistered as a trade union. His actions are evidently biased in that he appears to primarily target COSATU unions, non-COSATU unions. Sorry, COSATU. The Register of Labor Relations has become the employers and government activists to impose the holding of a strike ballot as if it were an explicit requirement of Labor Relations Act. Another development is that unions have been interdicted from striking because they have not yet amended their constitution requiring recorded and secret ballots before striking. The interdicts are based upon Section 19 of the Labor Relations Act, Amendments Act 8 of 2018, which states that until the union complies with a directive from the Register of Labor Relations about amending its constitution, it must conduct a secret ballot of members. Many unions cannot call an urgent and special national congress, which is extremely costly, to amend the constitution. They must wait the 3 or 5 years until the next ordinary congresses, and in the meantime, run the risk of having their strike interdicted. The balloting guidelines are also overly bureaucratic. How can a ballot for an industry strike be organized without costing the union huge amounts of money? And then it must report to the Register of Labor Relations during the strike, justifying that the ballot was in accordance with balloting guidelines. These guidelines only serve to prevent poor workers and poor unions from exercising their constitutional right. Interdicts, meddling by the Register of Labor Relations, and overly bureaucratic balloting guidelines makes lawful strike extremely difficult. They promote litigation from employers who use the interdict to affect the workers' pay. They create uncertainty within union members as to whether the strike is protected or not, and whether, as a result, they can be dismissed for engaging in an unprotected strike. They generate frustration on the ground as workers attempt to resolve their grievances are prevented through technicalities. This has motivated many workers to begin to lose faith in the legal system. In short, the amendments are a brake on union activity and the right to strike, and they have become a great engine of oppression against workers and their unions. SAFTU demands that amendments and the balloting guidelines must be repealed. Picketing rule. Similarly, the new provision regarding picketing rules have kept the right to picket and to strike. They have given employer many legal ways to interfere with and prevent pickets, thereby again affecting the balance of power in the employer's favor. Many employers have sought and are willy-nilly granted interim interdicts requiring workers to picket hundreds of meters from the employer. In some cases, hundreds of meters from the perimeter of the employer fence. These interdicts affect the power play. The effect is to render the strike less effective. They deny the right to strike and provoke the volatility of the situation on the picket line. In many of this type of application, employers complain that SAPS refuse to intervene unless and until there is a court order on that SAPS inform the employer that they lack capacity to respond. These complaints by employers are widespread, that it appears that stock paragraphs to this effect are contained in many employers' attorney interdict precedents. The complaint has now become accepted as general truth simply because of its relentless repetition. It is often not true. In many cases, the police use these excuses as a way of not having to deal with the exaggerated complaints of the employer. These amendments have promoted a view that trade unions must play a greater role in policing their members and supporters. Policing one's member is difficult and poses the real risk that the union and its official will lose the authority and influence over their members because they become perceived as siding with the employer. It is all too easy, especially for those who have little experience of the picket line, to say that a union must control their members and supporters. Now, SAFTU demands that the amendments to the picketing rules must be repealed. A fair dispensation is required, not one that promotes the interest of the ruling class in their attempts to hinder strikes. On the arbitration, the introduction of the advisory panel is another dramatic inroad in the right to strike. It can only be used, and indeed has been used, to influence the balance of power in the employer's favor. The recent referral by the plastic employer for an advisory arbitration is a case in point. The system of advisory arbitration only serves to embroil unions and their members in complicated and technical proceedings, thereby providing employers with possibility to intervene in the power play and dampen the workers' resolve to strike. The whole idea of advisory arbitration is unworkable, and SAFTU demands that the amendments must be repealed. Workers' rights to a living wage. South Africa was always a very unequal country as a result of colonialism, capitalism, and apartheid. These inequalities have worsened over the past 26 years. I wish I could not have been saying this, but it's the reality. Due to neoliberal economic policies imposed against the will of the working class and our allies, the COVID-19 catastrophe has amplified these inequalities. The biggest cause of these inequalities is unequal access to employment at a living wage, the skyrocketing unemployment crisis, which during the COVID-19 lockdown immediately worsened with the reported loss of 3 million formal jobs and 1.5 million informal jobs, and the soaring gap between pay earned by worker and taken by executive, as at utterly unacceptable level. SAFTU demands the following: end inequality, policies that will dramatically reduce the world's worst income and wealth inequalities, including a generous basic income grant, a renewed and enforced state moratorium on all evictions and services disconnection, and nationalization of the commanding heights with strict exchange control imposed to prevent capital flights, pay a living wage, a monthly minimum wage at least to be 12,500, as opposed to what is in place now. Impose a maximum salary, including cuts in the salaries and other benefits enjoyed by the executive and board members of corporations, parastatal agencies, and the top layer of civil servants whose overpayment in relation to the mass of the citizenry has reached extreme proportion unprecedented in the country's history, and indeed unequaled anywhere else in the world today. Reform of the political electoral system. The magnificent turnout of people to vote in the first democratic elections was awe and uninspiring. Around the world and here at home, the picture of winding queues waiting to vote sparked joyous celebration. It represented the realization of a core demand that is the power of our people to freely elect a party to lead government. Unfortunately, the enthusiasm that accompanied that first election has all but been extinguished. If the various factional fights within the established political parties reflect anything, it must be that formal politics is not primarily concerned with meeting the needs of our people, but is instead a jockeying for power and patronage. Increasingly, at election time, less people bother to vote, and even less appear to have any faith in those elected. We do not subscribe to the explanation that seeks to explain this as voter apathy, as if the people are somehow to blame for the ineffectiveness of politicians. Some argue that we get the caliber of politicians that we deserve, but this too misses the point. The fact is that overwhelmingly, politicians at the national and local level do not positively relate to those who elected them, but rather, first and foremost, to the internal rhythm of their own parties. Given the present electoral system that we have, which is largely based on a list system, this is hardly surprising. Internal factional squabbles are inevitably based on factional advantage, tied to power or wealth, and not on meeting the needs of constituencies. SAFTU believe it is time to critically review the current electoral system, and especially the relationship between elected representatives and the people they claim to represent. For this reason, we are embarking on a research study to evaluate models of representation that will shift the emphasis of accountability towards the people as opposed to party bosses. The recent constitutional ruling challenging the party system of undermining the right of individuals to contest election could provide an opening for such a discussion. and it must be grasped with both hands. SAFTU demands NEDLAC to invite inputs and contributions to an inclusive and open discussion on how best to ensure that those elected can be made directly accountable to those that elected them, and that this should take place within the next 3 months. On the state of the economy, the need to overhaul the economy. The South African economy can be lucrative, one, if you are wealthy. But if you are poor, it will impoverish you further. South African capitalist has become incapable of meeting even the most basic needs of its people. A visit to any township, and we invite you, Madam Speaker, to do that. Just visit one township and see what is happening there. Or informal settlement. You know, there is one here called, it used to be called Dinawe, but it's now Caleb Mutsabi. We invite you to just venture into that area and see what is happening there. We'll provide the harsh evidence of what the majority of our people experience on a day-to-day basis. A neoliberal approach to the economic entrenches rather than liberate the exploitative practices. The particular development of capitalism in South Africa has left behind a legacy of long-term chronic inequality, unemployment, and poverty. In fact, the success of capitalism in South Africa has been deepened on the continuing impoverishment of the working class and the poor. It has never worked for the mass of its people, but has unwavering maintained the wealth and privilege of the elite. This may have been marginally changed by boardroom black empowerment, but it has not fundamentally altered or challenged the power and wealth of those who control the economy, and through that to influence the political direction of our economy. This is why SAFTU demands that the South African economy be overhauled to rid itself of the vestiges of racism and colonialism that continue to shape the economy. This has been acknowledged as recently as May 2020 by the President to a meeting of news editors. Currently, the economy suffers from combination of super exploitative services and petty trade, a withering manufacturing sector worth about half the contribution to the GDP it was in 1994. A mainly parasitic financial sector, an often paralyzed state sector, a near-dead construction sector, an erratic agricultural sector, vulnerable to climate crisis, and the continuing extraction of mineral with barely any beneficiation to the local economy, so that we have to rebuy products from other countries made with our raw material. We demand as SAFTU that acknowledge and respect historic demands to share society wealth made by generations of workers, peasants, women, youth, and other social movements, including political parties. The banks and other corporations should be placed under public ownership. Simple technical ownership of mineral is obviously not enough. The 1998 Mineral Act did restore public ownership of the wealth beneath the ground. Yet, at the same time, hoodwinked society into relying upon multinational corporations to extract those minerals for the common goods. The corporations' abject failure to allow redistribution of wealth and to reinvest properly for longer-term development is a lesson for all. Our national wealth simply cannot be left in the hands of those whose primary purpose is the private accumulation of capital. The wealth these corporations now control must be expropriated so as to make resources available for social useful programs, especially those aimed at poverty alleviation, gender equity, employment, and environmental restoration. Reverse the debilitating self-destruction impact of private property relations. To meet these needs of our people now, in the future, we need emergency legislation to bring the main banks, the mines, the monopoly industries into public ownership under democratic worker and community control and management. The agency has never been greater. The later Reserve Bank statistics for the current account deficit show massive offshoring of profits resumed in the second quarter of 2020, thus reversing the first current account surplus in 17 years. This was made worse by government resorting to the International Monetary Fund in August 2020, and this threatening the sovereignty of South African policy making and implementation more difficult. It is urgent to halt profit outflows and fully audit external debt. The damage done by banking, and especially the facilitation of what Treasury admits is $10 to $25 billion in illicit financial flows that involve mining and other major industries. We need not only return to the 1994 Reconstruction and Development Program, which we fear is yet another hollow promise within the ruling party's latest economic plan. We need the introduction of an economic plan based on the needs of the poor and working people, with special reference to our young people, women, the vulnerable, and our environment, and not the continuing accumulation by billionaires. Reorganize all economic life on the basis of democratically planned economy. It remains vital to remove obstacles associated with private property rights, such as those preventing logical planning in urban areas due to the power of the real estate industry, or halting the redistribution of vitally needed healthcare resources within an apartheid-style health insurance and healthcare system. Our society and its economy is distorted by the profit motives, and this has prevented meeting the formidable public health, economic, and social environmental needs of our people. Break up the monopolies. Government must study and implement the recommendation arising from research funded by the Department of Trade and Industry and conducted by the University of Johannesburg Center for Competition, Regulation and Economic Development. They have established that there has been increasingly corporate concentration leading to anti-competitive behavior. More importantly, they found that the cash reserves in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange's largest 50 companies had increased from 242 billion to 1.4 trillion between 2005 and 2016. Government must aggressively tax all companies that are hoarding wealth that should be invested for the common good. Force firms to invest in the domestic productivity economy. Tighten the exchange control, reintroduce prescribed asset, and generate new state securities that compel the fast liquid capital in South Africa to flow in the real economy, especially to rebuild our manufacturing and construction industries for ecological conscious infrastructure, especially aimed at meeting basic needs. renationalized steel. It is well known that ArcelorMittal, which used to be state-owned ISCO in the past, has abused the economy through its pricing and milking of the assets sold to Lakshmi Mittal in 2003. By nationalizing this firm, the state can again produce steel that is inexpensive and vital to development the country's unequal distributive infrastructure, and to feed downstream industry with local production. Rationalize petrochemical, oil, and gas. Sasol, which has been allowed to not only privatize but spend more than 250 billion to build a failing white elephant complex in the United States of Louisiana, must be rationalized so that it can contribute to rather than undermine the transition to a genuinely decarbonized green economy. And for example, in the interim, provide inexpensive fertilizer to permit agrarian reform and promote enable food sovereignty. Promote appropriate R&D. The fetish with the fourth industrial revolution has done enormous damage already by fueling fantasies of global competitiveness. In a sector that is fraught with danger, e.g. robotics, dominating human life, with surveillance and civil liberty threatened, and Gauteng e-tolls, and with emphasis on intellectual property rights. In reality, many parts of South Africa cannot claim to even have experienced a first industrial revolution involving basis, agricultural and transport, not to mention electricity, clean water, access to technology. Much of South Africa is vulnerable to Eskom's load shedding, a problem we are told will last many years longer. The attention being given to the fourth industrial revolution in its current form is misplaced, and we need instead a clear program to support the most urgently needed components of government's industrial policy action plan through a more vigorous and aggressive approach to appropriate R&D. Re-establishment the vast mineral wealth into society hands. There was an estimated 42 trillion rands worth of platinum, gold, iron ore, and other valuable minerals in South Africa. According to a Citigroup study in 2011, the International Monetary Fund found in 2018 that among countries with reliable data, only 5 had more financial and non-financial assets than South Africa. Since 1994, it is undeniable that the government has served the interest of mining capital, including a handful of black entrepreneurs, and has failed society, our government, and future generations. Mining in South Africa was fundamentally based not only extracting national resources, e.g. half the world's gold, and exporting the profits, but also on cheap migrant labor whose subsidization by unpaid women's labor reached extreme level of super exploitation. To a larger extent, both the uncompensated extraction from our soil and abuse of migrant workers continues to this day. Colonial and apartheid objectives were to extract as much mineral wealth as possible and to divide and conquer the workforce so as to prevent the African majority from becoming anything other than subjugated class.
Honorable Musia, I give you 2 minutes to wrap up.
Oh.
Yes.
Okay.
And you can submit the document if there are some issues that you still want them to be reflected on our report. Then we
Okay.
will reflect them.
No, I guess it's best that I submit because I still have a lot on my plate.
Okay.
So,
You can just wrap up, just 2 minutes.
yeah. No. Let me just wrap up. Well, I commit program director to submit this document because it covers a whole range of issues that are affecting our society. So I'll wrap up. I'll say thank you very much having allowed me this opportunity to present from this podium, and I'll submit this as demands of SAFTU on behalf of SAFTU members and the working class broadly. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Musia. And now it's an opportunity now for SAFTU affiliates. Can I just recognize one hand? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hands, 6 hands. So at least there's a balance, 6. You can ascend to the podium in that order.
Thank you, Program Director. All protocol observed. Program Director, I am just going to talk about the challenges we faced at the workplace.
Your name and the name of the federation.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Geneva, the surname is Bojang. I'm from Ditau. Democratized Transport and Allied Workers Union. Program Director, I thought Mayor Brown will be here. From his speech, I noted crucial statements from his speech, and because after work I am a community member, I felt it was very important for me to talk about that, particularly the basic need, which is water. As we are all aware that Thabo Mofutsanyane is having a serious problem with water. I'm talking about Thabo Mofutsanyane because I am from Thabo Mofutsanyane, Program Director. Let me start by saying, Program Director and the Speaker, every time we will be told that employment decline, whereas employment have been taken by the foreigners. Our people, particularly the people in the Free State, are not working because their jobs are being taken by the foreigners. Our people will remain unemployed as long as our province does not take its people, does not prioritize its people. Foreign companies or shops are employing Lesotho people. It's not that comrades and I don't know, what do we call you when we are in parliament? Honorables. It's not that I am negative, but here I think we need to put the facts straight. The shops in town, go in Bloemfontein at the downtown, you'll find that the people who are working there are Lesotho nationals. We are pleading, Speaker, that at least preference be given to South African citizens. As we normally say, charity begins at home. I don't think the work that they are doing at the shop It's a skilled job that cannot be done by a South African citizen. Madam Speaker, even in the road freight companies, we are having foreign nationals that are working there. We are having agents of bargaining council whose their jobs is to monitor. But if you check, you find that the South African people, if the company employs 10 people, 3 are South African, 7 are foreign nationals. Because the companies believe that foreign nationals, they are cheaper than the South African. Our provincial government gave tenders to security companies. Most of them are fly-by-nights. Program Director, I am very happy to be invited in this Workers' Parliament because the security guards or security officers are the members of DITAWI. It is disgusting to find that the very same security officer who are working under a certain company or employed by a certain company secure government buildings. But at the end of the month, these workers are not get paid. Every time when you ask the employer will say, the government have not yet paid me. So the question is, who is the employer in this case? If the employees are being told that the governments have not paid the tender, then let the government, from the money of tendering, let the government pay the security officer. The poor workers are expected to report for duty the following day, and neatly so. Honorable Speaker, I believe for the government to invite us in this parliament is to ensure that at least the government try to alleviate the problems that we are facing at the workplace. Load shedding affects workers negative as they are not paid for the hours that load shedding was in place. So we also, on that, Speaker, request that the government intervene. I don't know how, but maybe you'll be able to intervene. In our province, we have sectors that are ship sharing. And when you check that sector, ship sharing, the sector is not formalized. The sector employs people from Lesotho. The sector trains people from Lesotho to be the ship sharer. So we are saying, let the government intervene. We have so many people in the settlement area where most of them, they are from the farms. It is advisable if the government goes out to the people and say to the people, there are ship sharers, let the government take stand. Let the government try to intervene and assist people. Some of the people, they believe ship sharer, it's not a job. It's a skill job, Speaker. And we request that in that job, let the South African be employed. Again, also, let the government go to people and tell people about the agriculture. It's a job. It's not that there is no job in South Africa. There is job in South Africa. There is job in Free State. Though the job is not so much high, but most of the job are being, foreigners are being accommodated in those jobs. So it is important for us to highlight that Speaker, so that our people be employed in that. In closing, Speaker, one may think we are turning this workers' parliament a complaint forum, but the truth is that we raise the challenges believing that or hope that it will be alleviated by the government. I thank you.
We can get another affiliate, the next one.
Thank you, Speaker. My name is Vuyani Mbangwa. I'm the Provincial Secretary of Food and Allied Workers Union in Free State and Northern Cape. Madam Speaker, within our scope of organizing, we have what we call food and beverage manufacturing. And this is one area where we have experienced a decline in growth and suffered job losses over the years. And one of the contributing factors is illicit economy. The goods traded illicitly are wide range and include, amongst others, soft drinks, beverages, tobacco and cigarettes, sugary and sweetened candies, white spirits of alcohol, and many others. And we are raising this, Madam Speaker, for the sake of our jobs, health of our people in the province, and revenue to the fiscus. When we talk about revenue to the fiscus, whatever that is produced in our country, certainly in areas of food and drinks, must elicit tax compliance or must be produced in conditions of full declaration on volumes and complete tax compliance. And when we talk about health and healthy food, drinks and others, goods produced must meet the health, hygienic and other quality standard. And thirdly, when we talk about, for the sake of our jobs, as a union, we are interested in local jobs. It's given that illicit products will lead to decline in sales in legitimate companies, and as a result, companies will have no option but to embark on Section 189. But in responding to this challenge, Madam Speakers, we know that Honorable Makalo Mohale embarked on a clampdown campaign sometime last year in Botshabelo. Although we welcome the efforts by the Honorable Makalo, we are saying a once-off event will not be adequate enough to confront and curb the extent of illicit economy in our province. And operating in silos with no benefit of those specialized in other areas may not result in increased efficiencies, and there is a need for a singular approach to be abundant in favor of multidisciplinary approach mobilized in special task forces. The Ministry of Health does not enjoy as many and as much competencies in enforcing existing current health policies, especially the ones regulating to the manufacturing. We can make examples of the outbreak of listeriosis. Those with competencies in local municipalities may not have such capacity, or their preoccupations may be with service delivery on areas of housing, roads, and other delivery priorities for residences than on health and hygiene. What is more critical, Madam Speaker, is all relevant stakeholders must be coalesced into a specialized multidisciplinary task force in order to clamp down on illicit products in our province. This multidisciplinary task force will be able to get programs unfolding into preventative activities, whether at SARS or at DSTIA, police, local municipal law enforcers, and many others, like investigations into current contraventions, detectives or of wrongdoing, intelligence, gathering into planned transgressions, and enforcement of the laws as they exist. So, Madam Speaker, what we want to suggest is that in order to clamp down on these illicit products, all these relevant stakeholders must come together and establish a task force that will mainly focus on clamping down on this illicit economy. Thank you very much.
The next affiliate.
Thank you, Program Director. And I must as well comply that I must observe the protocol, as other honorable members have done. Basically, what we will be talking to, because a number of issues have been covered by...
Your identity, please.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you. I'm Jihatsi Onya. I'm from Salipsu. I'm the Deputy Secretary General. Thank you. We want to speak on the issue of bargaining council, Honorable Speaker, which is quite important. Because we believe that the council, the bargaining processes are extremely compromised in this country. We can cite two examples. We made an analysis of the bargaining processes from around 1995 until 2015. Various collective agreements. We can remember that around 1999 there was a unilateral implementation by the government, irrespective of the unions not agreeing to it. And we also observed that the last agreement, the government also reneged and unilaterally took decision not to implement. And to add more salt to the wound, it even went out to use the powers of courts to actually cement that particular approach, which was saying it is actually compromising and killing and collapsing the bargaining council. And we take tune. If I may just make an example, when you analyze particularly the issue of austerity programs, one will cite an example of Greece as a country which adopted austerity programs. And what actually obtained from such austerity programs are the following, which I believe they are similar to South Africa. One, it was collapse of the bargaining council in Greece, where government unilaterally took decisions, which actually happened in this country. The society in Greece were facing serious food prices and energy going up and salaries going down, which fundamentally there's no improvement in terms of salaries again in the country, which are witnessing both private and public sector. And the issue of bargaining council, on the basis of taking tune from the government, the private sector as well started. We are seated with Clover, we are seated with mining sector. There are serious problems that are actually rearing their ugly head there. The rising of unemployment. That is what was happening in Greece, and is currently happening in this country. So it shows that instead of actually uplifting, because it comes with a strict structural adjustment programs decided upon by IMF as to how to run your country, it means it compromises the sovereignty of the country. As we speak, the country is compromised, its sovereignty is compromised, because one, it owes too much, almost trillions of money, which the services, Honorable MEC of Finance or Treasury has actually alluded to that. So we are raising that particular. The amendment of labor laws, that is what was experienced in that country, and we experience it here. And it was unilateral. And the gains that were actually, it becomes a problem, Madam Speaker, when the champions of these labor laws actually, out of we don't know what, then decided to change and take a particular trajectory. It becomes a problem. So that's why we are worried about that. The budget cuts, extreme budget cut. You go to education, for instance, it's budget cut in terms of infrastructure. And the MEC of Finance alluded to that fact, that a company has to move because of serious infrastructure challenges. You go to education, schools, it's a problem. I'm sure more than 100 schools in Eastern Cape had to be closed because of cuts, which actually led to one thing, increase in terms of teacher-learner ratio, which became a problem. And at the same time, we are talking about improving standard of education. We want to be on par with other international role players. That becomes a fundamental contradiction in terms of our policy trajectory. That is the issue that we are raising. Inequalities, we spoke about inequalities that are quite acute. And it brings again to the issue of bargaining and bargaining strategies. For instance, in bargaining councils, you'd find a situation that after a deal is signed and a collective agreement is signed, the nature of the collective agreement would say it's across the board. Across the board arrangement is one strategy that even the united and organized labor should actually consider. It means you are maintaining status quo, and it means inequalities are there to stay. At some point, when you analyze, like I said, the collective agreements from 1995 to the last one, there were instances where an agreement was to say on sliding scale, and in particular, Madam Speaker, was actually trying to mitigate these acute inequalities that we began to actually see. And another point that is raised, that is very key for bargaining council. How do you ensure that, because we have the higher echelons, we have individuals that are occupying higher echelons of administration and bureaucracy. How do you ensure that with a serious PACs, outside their salaries, there are serious PACs